During a violent Arctic storm, Eskimo fisherman Nukka spotted something impossible in the churning black waters. A tiny polar bear cub, barely 3 months old, was drowning in the icy waves that could kill a grown man in minutes. Without hesitation, Nukka dove into the freezing ocean, his thick parka dragging him down as he fought against the current to reach the helpless creature. Against all odds, he pulled the cub to safety and carried it back to his small igloo, where he spent 3 days nursing it back to health with fish broth and body warmth. The village elders warned him that saving the cub was a mistake that would bring the mother's wrath upon them all. When the massive mother bear finally appeared at the village edge, every soul prepared for revenge. But what happened next would change everything they believed about the spirit of the wild. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Uki sits like a cluster of ancient mushrooms against the endless white expanse of the Arctic tundra. 47 souls bound together by necessity, tradition, and the shared understanding that survival here requires both individual strength and collective wisdom. Nukka's fishing spear, carved from walrus bone by his grandfather's hands 3 generations ago, leans against the entrance to his family's igloo, a reminder that every tool, every skill, every breath of life in this place connects to those who came before. The morning after the storm finds the village slowly emerging from their shelters, assessing damage and counting blessings. Ice-crusted breath clouds mark each person's movement through the settlement as they check on neighbors, secure loose equipment, and begin the careful process of returning to normal routines. But normal is a relative concept. In a place where temperatures can drop 40 degrees in an hour and where the aurora borealis serves as both compass and calendar, Nukka has lived his entire 38 years in Uki, learning first from his father Aput and later from the village's most respected elder Siku, whose weathered face carries the accumulated wisdom of 7 decades in this unforgiving landscape. Unlike many of the younger men who have moved south to find work in the larger settlements, Nukka chose to stay, drawn by something deeper than mere tradition. He possesses an intuitive understanding of the ice, the currents, and the subtle signs that mean the difference between a successful fishing expedition and becoming another cautionary tale whispered around the village fires. His wife Nayeli, daughter of the village's most skilled seamstress, brings her own gifts to their partnership. Her hands can transform seal hide into waterproof boots that will last through 3 winters. And her knowledge of traditional foods has kept their family healthy through seasons when store-bought supplies failed to arrive. Together, they represent the kind of practical partnership that makes survival possible in a place where romance must be balanced against the constant demands of staying alive. Their neighbor's daughter, Tapisa, aged 12, spends her afternoons learning from Elder Siku, absorbing the stories and songs that carry the village's collective memory. She has that particular quality of attention that marks children who will become the keepers of tradition, though she also asks the kind of questions that suggest she will not simply accept the old ways without understanding their purpose. Her presence in Nukka's story will prove more significant than anyone yet realizes. The village drum circle. 5 sealskin drums arranged in the community house, according to patterns established by the first families to settle this particular bend of the frozen coast, serves as both musical instrument and historical record. Each drum carries the names of the families it represents, carved in symbols that blend traditional Inuit writing with personal marks that distinguish one lineage from another. When the drums sound together during village meetings or celebrations, they create a resonance that seems to connect the living community with the spirits of ancestors, who chose this precise location for reasons that become clearer with each passing generation. Elder Siku often says that Uki was established not despite the harsh conditions but because of them. The particular combination of coastal access, inland hunting grounds, and natural wind barriers creates a micro-environment that, while still brutally challenging, offers just enough advantage to make permanent settlement viable. The original families who founded the village 300 years ago understood something about reading, the land that has been passed down through careful observation and hard-earned experience. Nukka's reputation in the village rests on his ability to find fish when others return empty-handed, but also on his willingness to share both his catch and his knowledge. He has never forgotten the winter when his own family nearly starved, saved only by the generosity of neighbors who had little enough for themselves. That experience taught him that individual survival and community survival are the same thing, a lesson that will influence every decision he makes in the extraordinary days ahead. The storm that brought the polar bear cub into their lives was unusual even by Arctic standards, carrying winds that stripped the ice from protected coves and created waves large enough to threaten boats that had weathered countless previous tempests. As Nukka prepares his nets for the day's fishing, checking each knot and testing each line, he carries with him the accumulated caution of a man who understands that the sea gives life and takes it with equal indifference. In this place where the margin for error approaches zero, where a single mistake can cost not just an individual life, but threaten the survival of the entire community, Nukka's decision to risk everything for a drowning animal will challenge every assumption the village holds about the proper relationship between human needs and natural law. Elder Siku's weather prediction stones lie scattered across the flat rock surface outside the community, house like ancient dice cast by invisible hands. Each smooth stone, worn by countless Arctic storms and polished by generations of careful handling, holds a position that speaks to those who know how to read their message. This morning, their arrangement tells a story that makes even the most experienced hunters pause and reconsider their plans. The stones speak of a storm unlike any the village has experienced in living memory. Not merely the familiar blizzards that sweep across the tundra with predictable fury, but something deeper and more dangerous, a convergence of weather systems that transforms the familiar Arctic landscape into an alien world where survival rules must be rewritten on the spot. Nukka studies the stone pattern as he has done every morning since childhood, his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory, with instructions passed down through generations of fishermen who learned to read the sky like a sacred text. Today, the stones form a configuration he has seen only once before, during the winter that claimed 7 members of the village and forced the survivors to rebuild their understanding of what it means to live at the mercy of forces beyond human control. The wind begins as a whisper, barely disturbing the snow crystals that dance perpetually across the frozen ground. But Nukka recognizes the particular quality of its voice, the way it seems to carry sounds from impossible distances and deposit them at his feet like warnings wrapped in ice. His nets, carefully arranged for today's fishing expedition, suddenly seem inadequate for what is approaching. Nayeli emerges from their igloo, carrying the wooden bucket she uses to collect fresh snow for melting. But she stops when she sees Nukka's expression. After 15 years of marriage, she has learned to read the subtle changes in his posture that indicate when the weather is about to become something more serious than mere inconvenience. The stones say no fishing today, she observes, glancing at the scattered markers that have guided village decisions for 3 centuries. The stones say no leaving the village today, Nukka corrects, though his eyes remain fixed on the horizon, where the sky has taken on the particular quality of light that precedes extraordinary storms. But the nets were damaged in yesterday's wind. If I don't check them now, we might lose everything we've worked to repair. The temperature drops 10 degrees in the span of 5 minutes, the kind of sudden change that can freeze exposed skin before the mind fully processes what is happening. Ice crystals begin forming in the air itself, creating a glittering curtain that transforms familiar landmarks into strange, threatening shapes. Young Tapisa appears at his elbow with the silent footsteps that mark children who have learned to move carefully in a world where sudden movements can mean the difference between safety and disaster. She carries her own smaller set of prediction stones, gifts from Elder Siku that she studies with the intense concentration of someone who understands that traditional knowledge represents survival, distilled into its most essential forms. My stones show the same pattern as yours, she tells Nukka with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when discussing subjects that would terrify adults. But they also show something else, something that doesn't usually appear in winter storm readings. Nukka kneels to examine Tapisa's stones, arranged in a pattern that mirrors the Elder's formation, but includes an additional element, a single white stone placed at the center that seems to glow with reflected light from the changing sky. The white stone represents life endangered but not yet lost. Possibility balanced on the edge of catastrophe. The wind strengthens, no longer whispering, but beginning to howl with the voice that every Arctic dweller recognizes as the sound of nature, asserting its absolute authority over human plans and ambitions. Snow begins to move horizontally rather than falling, creating walls of white that erase the boundary between earth and sky. Go back to your family, Nukka tells Tapisa, though his voice carries the kind of gentle authority that indicates advice rather than command. Tell Elder Siku that the patterns match the winter of the 7 deaths, but with the white stone added. She'll know what preparations to make. As Tapisa disappears into the swirling snow, Nukka makes the decision that will change everything. His nets represent months of work and the difference between his family's survival and starvation. But more than that, they represent his responsibility to the village's food security and his own identity as the fisherman others depend on when conditions become impossible. The storm descends like a living thing, transforming the familiar landscape into something primordial and hostile. As Nukka gathers his equipment and prepares to venture into conditions that violate every rule of Arctic survival, he carries with him the understanding that some responsibilities transcend personal safety. Nukka's sealskin parka hangs heavy across his shoulders as he fights through the storm toward the coastline, its traditional construction proving its worth against conditions that would defeat modern materials. The parka, sewn by Nayeli's mother using techniques perfected over countless generations, creates a protective shell that traps body heat, while allowing moisture to escape, a delicate balance that means the difference between survival and hypothermia. In conditions like these, the wind drives snow horizontally with such force that each step forward requires the full strength of muscles. Developed through decades of Arctic living, Nukka's world has shrunk to the few feet of visibility the storm allows, and he navigates by feel and instinct rather than sight, following the subtle changes in wind direction that indicate proximity to the water. When he finally reaches his fishing area, the sight that greets him defies everything he knows about Arctic marine life. The storm has created waves that tower 15 feet above the normal waterline, and the usually predictable current patterns have been transformed into a chaos of competing forces that seem to pull in every direction simultaneously. His nets, carefully positioned to take advantage of seasonal fish migration patterns, have been twisted into impossible configurations by the turbulent water. But as Nukka begins the dangerous process of securing what equipment he can salvage, he hears something that stops him completely, a sound that cuts through the storm's roar with the unmistakable desperation of a living creature in mortal danger. At first, he assumes it must be a seal pup separated from its mother, though the timing is wrong for pupping season. But as he peers through the driving snow toward the source of the sound, he sees something that makes him question his own eyes. A tiny polar bear cub, so young its fur still carries the grayish tinge of extreme youth, struggles in the churning water with the exhausted movements of an animal at the very limit of its strength. The sight violates every natural law Nukka understands about polar bear behavior. Mother bears do not bring cubs this young near human settlements, and they certainly do not allow them to venture into water during storm conditions that would challenge adult bears. Yet here is a cub, alone and dying, in waters that have already begun the process of freezing around its small body. The decision to act requires no conscious thought. Nukka strips off his outer boots and secures his parka's hood with the bone toggles his grandmother carved 50 years ago, then plunges into water cold enough to stop a human heart within minutes. The shock of submersion drives the breath from his lungs and sends ice crystals forming in his blood. But training and desperation carry him forward through water that moves like liquid death. The cub's exhaustion works in Nukka's favor, as it lacks the strength to fight his rescue attempt with claws that could easily shred human flesh. Instead, it clings to him with the desperate instinct of any young animal seeking warmth and safety, its small body trembling with cold and terror as Nukka fights the current to reach shore. The journey back to solid ground becomes a race against hypothermia for both rescuer and rescued. Nukka's muscles begin to lock up as his core temperature drops, and only the familiar weight of the seal-skin parka saves him from the kind of heat loss that kills Arctic hunters who venture too far from safety. The cub's breathing has slowed to the point where each exhale might be its last, and its fur has frozen into icicles that tinkle like wind chimes with each labored movement. By the time Nukka reaches his igloo, both he and the cub hover on the edge of unconsciousness. His hands have lost feeling completely, and his legs carry him forward through muscle memory rather than conscious control. The cub weighs no more than a large fish, but in his weakened condition, it feels like he's carrying the full weight of a decision that will ripple through the village like cracks spreading across thin ice. Nayeli's face appears in the doorway, and her expression shifts from relief at seeing her husband return to shock as she realizes what he carries. For a moment that stretches like eternity, she stares at the unconscious polar bear cub cradled against Nukka's chest, understanding immediately that their life has just changed in ways neither of them can yet comprehend. The warm air inside the igloo creates steam clouds around their frozen forms as Nukka collapses beside the seal oil lamp that provides their home's heat and light. His parka, soaked with freezing seawater, begins the slow process of drying while protecting both him and the cub from further heat loss. "Help me," Nukka whispers through lips too numb to form words properly, and Nayeli moves with the swift efficiency of someone who has spent her entire life responding to survival emergencies that allow no time for questions or hesitation. Nayeli's grandmother's healing pouch sits open beside the seal oil lamp, its contents spread across the caribou hide mat like an ancient pharmacy designed specifically for the unique challenges of Arctic survival. Each item within the pouch carries generations of accumulated wisdom, dried herbs that can reduce fever, bone needles for emergency surgery, and small vials of oil extracted from plants that somehow thrive in the brief Arctic summer. The unconscious polar bear cub lies between them, so small that it could fit comfortably in Nukka's arms, yet so alien to their domestic space that its presence transforms their familiar igloo into something uncertain and potentially dangerous. Nayeli's initial impulse is the kind of primal fear that keeps Arctic families alive, the understanding that predators, regardless of size, represent threats that must be eliminated before they can mature into something lethal. But as she watches the cub's labored breathing and sees the way its tiny paws curl in unconscious gestures that mirror human infant behavior, something deeper than fear begins to surface. Her hands, trained in the careful arts of healing and nurturing that Arctic women master as a matter of survival necessity, begin moving with the same gentle precision she would use to tend a sick child. "Its temperature is too low," she murmurs, using the bone thermometer from her grandmother's collection to assess the cub's condition. "And look at its breathing, too shallow, too irregular. This little one is closer to death than life. Nukka strips off his frozen outer garments while Nayeli prepares a mixture of warm seal oil and fermented fish broth. A combination that provides both calories and easily digestible protein for weakened systems. The process requires delicate timing, as the mixture must be warm enough to provide therapeutic benefit, but not so hot as to shock an already traumatized digestive system. The cub's eyes open briefly as Nayeli attempts to administer the first drops of nourishment, revealing the startling blue that marks polar bear cubs during their first months of life. For a moment, the small creature focuses on her face with the kind of direct attention that suggests intelligence rather than mere instinct. And Nayeli feels something shift in her chest, a recognition that transcends species boundaries. She's a female, Nayeli observes, noting the subtle anatomical differences that distinguish male and female cubs. And she understands that we're trying to help her. The feeding process requires patience that would challenge even experienced parents. The cub's reflexes are suppressed by cold and trauma, making it difficult for her to coordinate sucking and swallowing. Each small success, a few drops of broth accepted and retained, represents a minor victory against odds that still favor death over him. Recovery. Nukka uses his body heat to warm the cub, while Nayeli continues the careful process of providing nourishment and monitoring vital signs. The igloo's temperature, normally maintained at a level that balances warmth against fuel conservation, has been raised to accommodate their patients' needs, requiring them to burn through seal oil reserves, normally saved for the deepest winter months. As the hours pass, the cub's condition slowly stabilizes. Her breathing becomes more regular, her body temperature rises to levels that no longer threaten immediate organ failure, and she begins to show responses to stimuli that indicate her nervous system is recovering from the trauma of near drowning and hypothermia. She'll need constant care for at least 3 days, Nayeli explains, consulting the traditional knowledge passed down through her maternal line. Cubs this young in the wild depend completely on their mothers for warmth, food, and protection. We'll have to provide all of that until she's strong enough to survive on her own. The implications of this commitment hang between them like smoke from the seal oil lamp. 3 days of intensive care means 3 days of explaining to curious neighbors why their igloo remains closed to visitors. It means 3 days of using precious resources on an animal that represents everything their survival-focused culture has taught them to fear and avoid. But as they work together through the long Arctic night, taking turns monitoring the cub's progress and providing the constant attention that keeps her alive, both Nukka and Nayeli begin to understand that they have crossed a threshold from which there may be no return. The decision to save this small life has already begun to change them in ways that extend far beyond the practical challenges of animal care. The cub, whom they begin calling Siku in honor of Elder Siku's wisdom about reading natural signs, responds to their care with trust that seems both heartbreaking and dangerous. She accepts food from their hands, seeks warmth from their bodies, and begins to show the first signs of the playful curiosity that will eventually make her both beloved and terrifying to the village that will soon discover her existence. By the 3rd day, as Siku grows strong enough to explore their small living space with unsteady but determined steps, Nukka and Nayeli face the reality that their actions have created bonds that cannot easily be severed. The talking stick passes from hand to hand around the circle of village elders, its carved driftwood surface worn smooth by generations of careful handling during the most serious community discussions. Elder Siku holds it now, her weathered fingers tracing the symbols that mark significant decisions made by previous generations, and her voice carries the weight of 7 decades spent learning when tradition must bend and when it must stand firm. Nukka brings danger to our village, she begins, her words falling into the silence of the community house like stones dropped into still water. Not intentionally, not with malice, but danger nonetheless. A polar bear cub means a polar bear mother, and a polar bear mother means death for anyone who stands between her and her young. The circle of faces around the seal oil lamps represents every family in Uki, each person carrying the accumulated wisdom and fears that have kept their community alive through 3 centuries of Arctic survival. Their expressions range from sympathetic understanding to barely controlled anger, but all share the common foundation of people who know that individual decisions can have fatal consequences for entire communities. Nukka sits beside Nayeli, their hands clasped together in the way that couples develop when facing criticism that threatens their fundamental choices. He has requested this meeting himself, understanding that his actions require community discussion and that attempting to hide Siku's presence would eventually lead to discovery and deeper conflict. The cub was dying, Nukka says when the talking stick reaches him, his voice steady despite the tension that permeates the gathering. In our tradition, we do not turn away from life that can be saved, whether it comes in the form of human child or injured animal. My grandfather taught me that the spirits judge us not by our fear, but by our willingness to act with compassion when action is required. Your grandfather, responds Aput, Nukka's own father, his tone carrying decades of accumulated worry about his son's tendency to make decisions based on emotion rather than practical calculation. Your grandfather also taught you that compassion without wisdom leads to graves. How many of us must die to satisfy your need to rescue every creature the storm deposits at our doorstep? The talking stick moves to Tapisa's mother, Panuk, whose normally gentle demeanor has been replaced by the fierce protectiveness that characterizes parents in dangerous situations. My daughter walks the paths between our igloos every day. She collects water from the same shore where you found this animal. If a mother bear comes searching, how do I explain to Tapisa's children why their mother became food for a predator we welcomed into our midst? The arguments continue as the talking stick makes its circuit, each person adding their voice to a discussion that reflects the fundamental tension between individual conscience and collective survival. Some speak of practical concerns, food supplies, safety protocols, the impact on winter hunting if polar bears begin associating human settlements with their offspring. Others reference traditional stories that warn against disrupting the natural order or challenging the authority of the great bears that rule the Arctic. Landscape. Elder Siku reclaims the talking stick as the discussion reaches its crescendo, her presence commanding the kind of attention that comes only with age and proven wisdom. I have listened to each voice, she says, and I hear the fear beneath every argument. Fear of the mother bear, yes, but deeper fear of change, of choices that force us to question the boundaries we have drawn between survival and compassion. She stands slowly, her movements carrying the dignity of someone who has participated in countless village decisions and understands the weight of collective responsibility. Nukka's actions challenge us to consider whether our traditions serve life or merely preserve the illusion of safety. The cub exists among us now, whether we approve or not. The question is not whether Nukka was right or wrong, but how we respond to the reality his choice has created. The silence that follows carries the weight of a community grappling with questions that have no easy answers. Young Tapisa, sitting beside her parents with the quiet attention that marks children during serious adult discussions, raises her hand with the tentative gesture of someone who understands that her voice carries less authority, but may offer perspectives that experience overlooks. "May I speak?" she asks, and Elder Siku nods, placing the talking stick in hands still small enough to remind everyone present of what they seek to protect. "I have seen this cub," Tapisa says, her voice clear despite her nervousness. "Not close, but from the respectful distance my parents taught me to maintain around wild animals." She moves with curiosity, not aggression. She explores with the same careful attention we teach our own children. Perhaps the question is not whether we can afford to harbor her, but whether we can afford to turn away from the possibility that some bridges between human and animal are meant to be built rather than burned. The hand-carved toy seal sits forgotten in the corner of Nukka's igloo, its smooth wooden surface polished by countless hours of Tapisa's childhood play. But now it has found a new purpose that no one could have anticipated. Siku, recovered enough to explore her temporary home with growing confidence, has adopted the small carving as her constant companion, carrying it from place to place with the focused attention that young animals give to objects that provide comfort and security. Watching Siku play with the wooden seal reveals aspects of her personality that transform her from an abstract symbol of danger into a specific individual with quirks and preferences that mirror the complexity found in any intelligent young creature. She approaches the toy with both paws, batting at it experimentally before scooping it up and rolling onto her back in a display of playful abandon that would be endearing in any context but becomes remarkable given her species and circumstances. She's learning our sense, Naili observes, noting how Siku investigates every corner of their living space with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory. And she's beginning to understand that this is her territory now, at least temporarily. The cub's growth over the past week has been remarkable, her body weight increasing visibly as regular feeding restores the strength that near drowning had depleted. Her movements have evolved from the unsteady wobbling of extreme weakness to the confident exploration that characterizes healthy young animals beginning to understand their physical capabilities. More significantly, Siku has begun to demonstrate the kind of problem-solving intelligence that distinguishes polar bears from other Arctic predators. When the wooden seal rolls under the sleeping platform, she figures out how to retrieve it by lying flat and extending one paw to maximum reach. When her water bowl sits too high for comfortable drinking, she learns to brace her front paws against the ice wall and stretch her neck to achieve the necessary angle. Tapisa arrives for her daily visit with the excitement of someone who has discovered that miracles can appear in the most unexpected forms. Over the past few days, she has become Siku's primary playmate, understanding intuitively how to interact with a young predator in ways that encourage natural behaviors while maintaining appropriate boundaries. "Look what she's learned," Tapisa whispers, producing a second wooden toy from her parka, a small carved fox that belongs to her own collection. She places it near the wooden seal and watches as Siku immediately recognizes the game, using her paws to move both toys around the igloo floor in patterns that suggest she understands the concept of play rather than simply responding to instinct. The interaction between child and cub creates a scene that challenges every assumption the village holds about the relationship between human settlements and Arctic predators. Instead of the aggressive dominance display that adult polar bears use to establish territory, Siku's behavior reflects curiosity tempered by respect for the boundaries that Tapisa establishes through gentle but consistent guidance. "She knows you're not prey," Nukka observes, watching how Siku moderates her strength when playing with Tapisa in ways that suggest conscious consideration rather than accidental restraint. "And she knows you're not a threat." That level of discrimination in a cub this young suggests intelligence that goes beyond what we normally expect from wild animals. Nayeli joins the play session, bringing strips of dried fish that serve as both nutrition and training rewards. Under her guidance, Siku begins to learn simple commands, not the complex obedience that characterizes domestic animals, but basic communication that allows peaceful coexistence within the confined space of their temporary home. The wooden seal becomes central to these learning sessions, serving as both toy and teaching tool. When Siku becomes too rough in her play, Nayeli removes the seal until the cub's behavior moderates. When Siku demonstrates appropriate gentleness, The toy returns as positive reinforcement for behaviors that will be essential if she ever returns to the wild. She's creating attachments. Tapisa observes with the insight that children often bring to animal behavior, not just to us, but to this place, to these objects, to the routines we've established. That's going to make it harder when the time comes for her to leave. The truth of this observation hangs over their interactions like weather that hasn't yet arrived, but can be felt approaching. Each day that Siku grows stronger and more integrated into their domestic routine, each moment of play that deepens the bonds between species, creates emotional investments that will be difficult to abandon when practical necessities demand separation. But for now, in the warm space of the igloo, where the seal oil lamp creates pools of golden light and the wooden toys provide endless entertainment, the impossible has become routine, and a polar bear cub has found temporary membership in a human family that never expected to extend their definition of kinship beyond the boundaries of their own species. The ancient bear claw necklace rests against Elder Siku's chest as she watches Nukka begin the difficult process of preparing Siku for eventual independence. Its 5 massive claws, representing the 5 sacred directions and the delicate balance that must be maintained between respect and vigilance when dealing with the Arctic's most powerful predators. Each claw was taken from bears that died of natural causes, gathered over decades by village hunters who understood that such artifacts carry both protective power and solemn responsibility. Nukka's training sessions with Siku begin before dawn, when the village still sleeps, and their activities can proceed without the complicated dynamics that public observation would create. In the blue twilight that passes for Arctic morning during this season, he guides the young bear through exercises designed to strengthen her natural survival instincts while gradually reducing her dependence on human care and comfort. Wild bears don't eat from bowls, he explains to Siku as he scatters pieces of fish across the snow, forcing her to use her natural foraging behaviors rather than the passive feeding that has characterized her recovery period. They hunt, they search, they work for every meal. You need to remember how to be a bear, not a pet. The process requires a delicate balance between encouraging independence and maintaining the trust that has developed between them. Siku responds to Nukka's guidance with the focused attention of someone learning skills that feel both foreign and familiar. Her movements becoming more confident as muscle memory inherited from countless generations of polar bear ancestors begins to reassert itself. Swimming lessons prove particularly challenging, as Siku's near-drowning experience has created an understandable wariness of water that contradicts her species' natural affinity for marine environments. Nukka begins with shallow pools formed by melted snow, gradually increasing depth and current strength as Siku rediscovers the swimming abilities that will be essential for her survival in the wild. She remembers the fear, Nayeli observes, watching how Siku approaches each new water challenge with caution that suggests conscious memory rather than instinctive avoidance. But she also remembers that Nukka saved her from drowning. That creates confusion about whether water represents danger or safety. The training extends beyond physical skills to include the complex social behaviors that will determine Siku's ability to interact appropriately with other polar bears. When she eventually encounters them, Nukka uses his own body language to teach her about dominance displays, territorial boundaries, and the subtle communications that allow polar bears to assess each other's intentions without immediately resorting to violence. Bears communicate through presence as much as action. Elder Siku explains during one of her visits to observe the training sessions. Size, posture, eye contact, the direction of movement all carry meaning that determines whether encounters lead to conflict or peaceful coexistence. Our little Siku must learn these languages if she hopes to find acceptance among her own kind. The most difficult lessons involve teaching Siku to respond appropriately to the scent and presence of humans, other than those she has bonded with. Her natural trust of Nukka and his family, while heartwarming, could prove fatal if extended to hunters or others who would view her as a threat rather than a curiosity. She needs to fear what she should fear, Nukka says, introducing controlled exposures to unfamiliar human scents that trigger appropriate wariness without undermining her basic trust in the family that has cared for her. But she also needs to remember that not all humans are enemies in case she ever needs help again. The training reveals aspects of Siku's intelligence that continue to surprise everyone involved. She learns to associate specific vocal cues with different types of responses, demonstrates ability to delay gratification when food rewards require completing complex tasks, and shows clear preferences for certain activities that suggest personality traits extending beyond basic survival instincts. But perhaps most remarkably, Siku begins to initiate training sessions herself, bringing Nukka items like sticks or pieces of ice that she has learned to associate with learning activities. This behavior suggests not only intelligence, but also a desire to maintain the connection with her human family, even as she develops the skills that will eventually allow her to live independently. She understands that learning prepares her for something. Tapisa observes with the insight that has made her a valuable participant in the training process. But I don't think she understands that something means leaving us behind. The emotional complexity of preparing Siku for independence creates undercurrents of sadness that all the participants try to suppress in favor of focusing on practical necessities. Each successful training session brings her closer to readiness for wild living, but also closer to the inevitable separation that will break bonds none of them anticipated forming. As winter deepens and Siku's size and strength approach levels that will soon make her presence in the village impossible to conceal, Nukka faces the reality that his success as a teacher will ultimately require him to give up the student who has become like a daughter to his family. The ivory scrimshaw map spread across Elder. Siku's table tells the story of polar bear territory and migration patterns etched by her great-grandfathers. Careful hand over 70 years ago, each delicate line marking the seasonal movements that have governed Arctic life since the ice first formed. The map shows pathways invisible to casual observation, but essential to understanding how the great bears navigate their frozen domain, following currents and ice formations that change with each season but maintain patterns recognizable to those who know how to read the subtle signs. The fresh tracks discovered by village scouts 3 days ago match the territorial markers shown on the ancient map with unsettling precision. A massive female polar bear, based on the size and depth of her paw prints, has entered the region during the wrong season for normal migration patterns, suggesting purpose rather than random wandering. The tracks follow the coastal route that would bring her directly to Uki if she continues her current trajectory. She's searching, Elder Siku explains, her weathered finger tracing the route marked on both the historical map and the fresh scouting reports. Not hunting for food, not seeking territory, but looking for something specific. The pattern of her movement, the way she circles back to investigate areas that hold no prey, the deliberate approach to human settlements, all indicate a mother seeking her lost cub. Nukka studies the convergence of ancient knowledge and current reality, understanding that the maps his ancestors created to track polar bear movements have become tools for predicting his own family's fate. The mother bear's approach was inevitable from the moment he pulled Siku from the freezing water, but seeing her progress marked in precise geographic terms transforms abstract fear into immediate preparation requirements. How long before she reaches the village? Nayeli asks, though her tone suggests she already knows the answer will be measured. In days rather than weeks, if she maintains her current pace and doesn't encounter obstacles that force detours, she'll be within scenting distance of Uki in 4 days, Elder Siku responds. But bears don't travel in straight lines when they're tracking specific scents. She'll likely detect Siku's presence before she reaches the village perimeter, which could accelerate her approach significantly. The implications ripple through the gathering like cracks spreading across thin ice. Siku has grown considerably over the past weeks, her scent developing the complex chemical signatures that mark healthy young polar bears, and that would be unmistakable to her biological mother. The careful containment that has allowed the village to pretend this situation might resolve itself quietly has become impossible to maintain. Young Tapisa, present at these discussions because of her unique relationship with Siku, studies the scrimshaw map with the intense concentration she brings to all learning opportunities. The map shows feeding areas and denning sites, she observes, but it also shows places where bears have historically interacted peacefully with humans. Look here and over by the summer fishing camps. Elder Siku nods approvingly at the girl's insight. Your eyes see what experience teaches, child. Yes, there have been instances of peaceful coexistence, though they remain rare and usually brief. The question is whether those historical precedents offer guidance for our current situation or merely false hope for an outcome that violates natural law. The scout reports continue to arrive with disturbing regularity, each one bringing the mother bear closer to a confrontation that could reshape every assumption the village holds about human-wildlife boundaries. Her tracks show increasing focus as she approaches areas where Siku's scent would be carried by prevailing winds, suggesting that maternal instinct is guiding her with the kind of precision that makes evasion strategies futile. She knows her cub is alive, Nukka says, accepting the reality that his decision to rescue Siku has created consequences that extend far beyond his own family, and she knows roughly where to find her. The only question remaining is how she'll respond when she discovers that her cub has been living among humans, rather than struggling for survival in the wilderness. The scrimshaw map offers no guidance for this scenario, as the careful observations of previous generations never anticipated circumstances where human compassion would create bonds between species that evolution has designed to maintain respectful distance. The ancient wisdom etched in ivory provides context, but no solutions for a situation that exists outside the boundaries of traditional experience. Preparations begin immediately, though their nature reflects the uncertainty surrounding what those preparations should accomplish. Safety protocols designed for typical polar bear encounters seem inadequate for a situation involving a mother searching for offspring who have formed emotional attachments to her rescuers. The village must prepare for possibilities that range from peaceful reunion to violent confrontation, with no reliable way to predict which scenario will unfold. As night falls over Uki, the aurora borealis creates patterns of light that seem to mirror the complex uncertainties facing the community. The approaching mother bear represents both natural law asserting its authority and an opportunity to discover whether the bonds formed between Nukka's family and Siku might offer new models for coexistence that transcend traditional boundaries between human settlement and wild territory. The emergency signal horn, carved from whalebone, sits ready beside Elder Sik's door, its deep voice capable of carrying across the entire village and alerting every resident to immediate danger within seconds of the first blast. The horn has been used only 3 times in living memory, twice for blizzards that threatened to destroy the village, and once for the ice break that nearly claimed 4 hunters who ventured too far from shore during an unexpected warm spell. This morning, the horn remains silent, but its presence creates an atmosphere of expectation that transforms routine activities into preparations for something unprecedented. Children move closer to their parents. Adults complete tasks with the efficiency that comes from knowing normal routines may be interrupted without warning, and conversations carry undertones of subjects that cannot be discussed directly while life continues its necessary patterns. Nukka stands at the Village perimeter where the mother bear's massive form first appeared 20 minutes ago. A dark silhouette against the white expanse that initially seemed like a distant boulder until movement revealed its true nature. She approaches with the deliberate pace of someone confident in her power but uncertain about her destination. Her head moving from side to side as she tests wind currents for scents that will guide her final approach. Behind him, the village maintains the disciplined silence that Elder Siku's emergency protocols require when predators enter the settlement area. Doors remain closed, but not barricaded. Windows show no movement but stay unblocked for observation. And the emergency signal horn stays within reach, but unused until the situation develops beyond peaceful resolution possibilities. Siku, now grown to nearly half her mother's size, exhibits behavior that confirms the biological connection everyone has anticipated but hoped might somehow be avoided. Her head tilts with intense listening as sounds too subtle for human perception reach her ears, and her movements become restless in ways that suggest recognition rather than general anxiety about approaching danger. "She knows," Nayeli whispers from their igloo doorway, watching how Siku paces in circles that grow progressively wider as her mother's approach continues. She remembers her mother's voice, her scent, everything that marked their bond before the storm separated them. The mother bear stops approximately 50 yards from the village edge, her massive head raised to test air currents with the systematic thoroughness of someone gathering information rather than preparing for immediate action. Her size, impressive even by polar bear standards, suggests an animal in her prime, with experience that has taught her caution in situations that fall outside normal patterns of behavior. For long minutes, the standoff continues, with neither side making moves that could be interpreted as aggressive or submissive. The mother bear's posture indicates alertness rather than hostility, while the village maintains the respectful distance that Arctic survival requires when dealing with apex predators who could destroy human settlements if provoked beyond tolerance. Siku's response creates the most complex element of the developing situation. Her obvious recognition of her biological mother conflicts with equally obvious attachment to the human family that has cared for her during the most vulnerable period of her young life. She moves toward the village perimeter, but stops repeatedly to look back toward Nukka and Nayeli, her body language expressing conflict between competing loyalties that evolution never prepared her to navigate. She's torn. Tapisa observes with the insight that has made her particularly perceptive about animal behavior. She wants to go to her real mother, but she doesn't want to leave her adopted family. That's not just instinct anymore. That's emotion. The mother bear's keen intelligence becomes apparent as she assesses the situation with patience that suggests understanding rather than mere caution. Her eyes move between her biological offspring and the humans who have obviously been caring for the cub, and her posture gradually shifts from alert surveillance to something approaching curiosity about the unprecedented circumstances she has discovered. Nukka makes the decision that transforms the standoff into something entirely new in the relationship between human settlement and Arctic wildlife. Moving slowly enough to avoid triggering defensive responses, he walks toward the point where Siku waits between her two families, his hands visible and empty of weapons or tools that could be interpreted as threats. The mother bear's response to this approach will determine whether the next few minutes lead to tragedy or to possibilities that no one in the village has dared imagine. Her massive head follows Nukka's movement with attention that seems to analyze his intentions rather than simply assess his threat potential. And for the first time since her arrival, she takes a step closer to the village rather than maintaining her careful distance. Elder Siku's hand hovers near the emergency signal horn, ready to alert the village if the situation develops in directions that require immediate response. But her weathered eyes reflect wonder rather than Fear as she witnesses something that challenges every assumption her 7 decades of Arctic life have taught her about the unbridgeable distances between human civilization and wild nature. The peace-offering bowl sits in Nukka's steady hands as he approaches, the space between his adopted daughter and her biological mother, its carved surface depicting the traditional symbols of respect and non-aggression that have governed human-animal interactions in the Arctic for countless generations. The bowl, crafted by his grandfather from a single piece of driftwood that spent decades being shaped by ice and tide, represents the ancient understanding that some encounters require gestures that transcend the limitations of spoken language. The bowl contains strips of the finest fish from Nukka's personal stores, not the everyday catch that feeds his family, but the premium specimens normally reserved for honored guests and ceremonial occasions. The offering acknowledges the mother bear's status as a visiting presence deserving of respect rather than a threat to be repelled, a distinction that could determine whether this unprecedented moment leads to violence or understanding, as Nukka moves with the deliberate slowness that Arctic survival has taught him to use around potentially dangerous wildlife. The mother bear's massive head follows his approach with intelligence that seems to assess his intentions rather than simply monitor his threat potential. Her ears remain forward in a posture that indicates attention rather than aggression, and her powerful body maintains the balanced stance that allows for either retreat or advance, depending on how the situation develops. Siku, caught between her competing loyalties, begins making the soft vocalizations that young polar bears use to communicate with their mothers during periods of uncertainty or stress. The sounds carry across the frozen space between families with heartbreaking clarity, expressing emotions that seem to bridge the gap between animal instinct and recognizable feelings that any parent would understand. The mother bear responds to her cub's calls with answering vocalizations that speak a language older than human settlement in the Arctic, yet the tones carry nuances that suggest communication rather than simple recognition. She addresses her offspring with sounds that seem to ask questions. Where have you been? How have you survived? Who are these strange creatures that smell like family but look like something else entirely? She's not angry. Nayeli breathes from her position near the igloo, her voice barely audible but carrying relief that spreads through the watching village like warmth from a seal oil lamp. Listen to how she's talking to Siku. Those aren't the sounds of a mother furious about her cub being taken. Those are the sounds of someone trying to understand what happened. Nukka places the peace-offering bowl on the snow precisely halfway between himself and the mother bear, then steps back to a respectful distance that acknowledges her authority while maintaining his role as Siku's human caretaker. The gesture follows protocols established by generations of Arctic peoples who learned to coexist with apex predators through mutual recognition of boundaries and respect for territorial claims. The mother bear's response exceeds every expectation the village has formed about how this encounter might unfold. Instead of the aggressive dominance display that would characterize most polar bear interactions with potential threats to their offspring, she approaches the bowl with cautious curiosity that suggests evaluation rather than automatic rejection of human presence in her cub's life. She sniffs the offering with the thorough investigation that polar bears apply to anything new in their environment, her powerful nose analyzing not just the food itself, but the human scents that cling to the bowl and the intentions those scents might reveal. The examination continues for several minutes while the entire village holds its collective breath, understanding that her acceptance or rejection of the offering will set the tone for everything that follows. When the mother bear finally tastes the fish, her reaction provides the first indication that this situation might resolve in ways that no one dared hope. Instead of the rapid consumption that hungry predators typically display around unexpected food sources, She eats with deliberate care that suggests appreciation rather than desperate hunger, acknowledging the quality of the offering, and by extension, the good intentions of the one who provided it. Siku, emboldened by her mother's peaceful behavior, takes tentative steps toward the massive bear who gave her life, but continues to look back toward Nukka and Naeli with expressions that seem to seek permission or reassurance. Her movement creates a living bridge between the two families that have shaped her short existence, and her obvious health and contentment provide testimony about the quality of care she has received during her time among humans. The mother bear's examination of her cub reveals the extraordinary nature of what has transpired during their separation. Instead of the malnourished, traumatized offspring she might have expected to find after weeks in human care, she discovers a healthy, confident young bear whose behavior indicates positive treatment rather than captivity or abuse. Her massive head turns toward Nukka with direct eye contact that carries weight beyond simple acknowledgement. And for the first time in the village's 300-year history, a wild polar bear offers what can only be described as a gesture of gratitude to the human who saved her child's life. The friendship stone sits warm in Nukka's pocket, a smooth river rock that Siku presented to him during one of their training sessions, carrying it in her mouth with the deliberate care that young bears use to transport objects they consider valuable. The stone, polished by countless years of water and ice, has become the physical symbol of the unprecedented bond forming between species that evolution designed to maintain careful distance from each other. The mother bear's direct gaze meets Nukka's eyes with an intensity that transcends the usual warnings about never making eye contact with Arctic predators. Instead of the challenge or threat that such contact typically represents, her attention carries the focused quality of someone attempting to understand complex information that falls outside previous experience. Her massive head tilts slightly as she studies the human who has cared for her offspring, and her body language gradually shifts from cautious assessment to something approaching acceptance. Nukka responds by slowly removing the friendship stone from his pocket, holding it in his open palm, where both mother and cub can see the object that has become part of their shared history. Siku's immediate recognition of the stone creates visible excitement, her young voice producing the particular vocalizations she uses when greeting familiar objects that carry positive associations. The mother bear's response to her cub's obvious comfort with human interaction provides the foundation for what happens next. Instead of the protective aggression that would characterize most maternal responses to close contact between offspring and potential predators, she demonstrates curiosity about the relationships her cub has formed during their separation. Moving with the careful deliberation that has characterized every gesture since her arrival, Nukka extends his hand toward the massive bear, offering her the opportunity to investigate the stone that has become meaningful to her offspring. The gesture requires courage that goes beyond physical bravery to encompass the willingness to trust that understanding can bridge the gap between vastly different forms of intelligence. The mother bear's investigation of the stone involves the thorough sensory analysis that polar bears apply to everything in their environment. But her approach carries additional significance because it represents voluntary engagement with human presence rather than mere tolerance of proximity. Her powerful nose examines the stone's surface, detecting scents that tell the story of its journey from Siku's discovery to its current status as a token of interspecies friendship. She's accepting the connection, Elder Siku whispers from her observation position, her voice carrying wonder at witnessing something that challenges every assumption her 70 years have taught her about the unbridgeable distances between human civilization and apex predators. Not just tolerating it, but recognizing it as something valuable rather than threatening. Siku positions herself between her biological mother and her adoptive human family, her body language expressing the comfort of someone who no longer feels torn between competing loyalties, but instead sees herself as the bridge that connects two different forms of family. Her obvious contentment with this arrangement provides powerful testimony about the possibility of relationships that transcend traditional species. Boundaries, the mother bear's next action establishes the foundation for everything that follows. She gently touches the friendship stone with the tip of her massive paw, a gesture so delicate that it could easily be missed, but so intentional that its meaning becomes unmistakable. The touch represents acknowledgement not just of the object itself, but of what it symbolizes, the genuine care and affection that has developed between her cub and the humans who rescued her from certain death. Nukka's response demonstrates the intuitive understanding that has made this entire situation possible. Instead of attempting to retrieve the stone or maintain possession of what has become a symbol of their connection, he steps back and allows the mother bear to make her own decision about how to proceed. The gesture acknowledges her authority while expressing confidence that the bond formed with her cub has created mutual understanding. Rather than one-sided dependence, the mother bear picks up the friendship stone with the careful mouth, control that polar bears use to handle delicate objects without damage, and for a moment that seems to stretch beyond normal time, she holds the physical representation of the relationship that has saved her cub's life. Her eyes move between the stone, her offspring, and the human who has become an unexpected part of their family story. When she finally places the stone back on the snow between herself and Nukka, the placement is precise and deliberate, not a rejection of the gift, but a statement that the symbol belongs to the space they now share, rather than to any individual participant in their unprecedented alliance. The friendship stone rests on the white snow, like a declaration that some boundaries exist, not to separate, but to define the edges of territories where different forms of life can meet in mutual respect, and where understanding can grow from actions that speak louder than the languages that divide species from each other. The shared fishing net spreads across the ice like a web designed by creatures who understand cooperation transcends species boundaries. Its traditional construction now serving purposes that the village ancestors who wove it could never have imagined. The net, originally crafted for Nukka's solitary fishing expeditions, has become the centerpiece of an arrangement that challenges every assumption about the relationship between human survival strategies and Arctic wildlife behavior. 3 days have passed since the mother bear's peaceful arrival, and what initially seemed like an impossible situation requiring immediate resolution has evolved into something that resembles routine, though routine unlike anything the village has ever experienced. The massive polar bear, whom the villagers have begun calling Nukka in recognition of her role as Nukka's unlikely partner, has established a territory that encompasses the fishing areas while maintaining respectful distance from human dwellings. The fishing arrangement develops through trial and observation rather than explicit planning, as Nukka discovers that the bear's presence actually improves his success rates in ways that reflect the complex relationships between predators and prey in Arctic marine ecosystems. Nukka's ability to detect fish movements through ice that appears solid to human senses provides information that allows more precise net placement, while her powerful swimming creates currents that drive fish toward areas where Nukka's equipment can capture them most effectively. She's not just tolerating our fishing. Nukka explains to the village council during their daily briefing about the unprecedented situation. She's actively helping. When I position the net based on her signals about fish location, our catch rates increase by nearly 50%. It's as if she understands that successful fishing benefits everyone involved, Siku serves as interpreter and coordinator for this interspecies collaboration, her unique position allowing her to communicate with both her biological mother and her human family in ways that facilitate cooperation rather than competition. Her behavior suggests understanding that goes beyond simple obedience to either authority, indicating intelligence that enables her to recognize mutual benefit rather than zero-sum conflict. The village children, initially terrified by the presence of apex predators in their daily environment, begin to adapt with the remarkable flexibility that characterizes young minds encountering new realities. Tapisa leads this adjustment process, her natural affinity for animal behavior helping her establish appropriate boundaries that allow observation without interference. They're teaching us about fish patterns we never noticed, Tapisa reports after spending her morning watching the bears work. The way they position themselves shows where the fish school and which direction they move when the current changes. It's like having guides who can read underwater maps that we can't see. The net itself becomes a symbol of this collaboration, as its traditional design proves perfectly suited for techniques that combine human craftsmanship with polar bear instincts. The bears demonstrate careful handling of equipment that could easily be destroyed by creatures possessing their strength, suggesting consciousness about maintaining tools that benefit their partnership rather than viewing human artifacts as obstacles to be removed. Elder Siku observes these developments with the analytical attention she brings to all situations that fall outside traditional experience, her weathered eyes noting details that provide insight into the sustainability of arrangements that initially seemed too extraordinary to persist. The bears are learning our routines, she notes, but more importantly, they're modifying their own behaviors to accommodate our needs. That suggests intelligence and planning ability that extends beyond immediate survival requirements. The success of the fishing partnership begins to influence other aspects of village life as the bear's presence creates unexpected benefits that extend beyond food procurement. Their acute senses provide early warning about weather changes that human observation might miss, and their territorial behavior around the fishing areas actually increases security by deterring other predators that might threaten human activities. We're not keeping them as pets, Nukka emphasizes during discussions about the long-term implications of their situation. We're not domesticating them or trying to change their essential nature. We're learning to work within their natural behaviors in ways that benefit everyone involved. The shared fishing net embodies this philosophy, serving human needs while accommodating polar bear hunting instincts in arrangements that neither species could achieve independently. The collaboration demonstrates that cooperation can emerge from mutual recognition of benefit rather than requiring dominance or submission, suggesting models for coexistence that transcend the traditional boundaries between human settlement and wildlife territory. As the fishing partnership becomes routine, the village begins to understand that they are witnessing the development of something unprecedented in human-wildlife relationships, not the conquest of nature by civilization, but the discovery of harmony that respects the essential characteristics of both species while creating new possibilities for shared success in an environment that challenges all forms of life. The teaching stones lie arranged in careful patterns across the flat surface near the community house, their positions demonstrating the balance and harmony that Elder Siku uses to help village children understand the complex relationships that govern all life in the Arctic. Each stone represents different elements: ice, water, land, wind, and spirit, and their arrangement changes daily to reflect the lessons that natural observation provides about maintaining equilibrium in an environment where survival depends on understanding rather than conquest. Elder Siku's morning instruction session includes an unprecedented addition as Nukka and Siku position themselves at the respectful distance that has become their custom during human community activities. The massive mother bear's presence transforms routine educational activities into something that carries the weight of living demonstration, as her behavior provides examples of the principles that traditional teaching often struggles to make concrete for young minds. Balance, Elder Siku explains to the gathered children, adjusting the stone positions to reflect the current relationship between human settlement and wildlife presence, means understanding that our survival and their survival connect to each other rather than compete with each other. The old stories teach us that the spirits gave different gifts to different creatures, but all gifts serve the same purpose, maintaining life in a place where life requires constant cooperation. Tapisa, now recognized as the village's most gifted interpreter of bear behavior, demonstrates the communication techniques she has developed through careful observation and patient experimentation. Her ability to convey simple messages through gesture and posture has become essential to maintaining the peaceful coexistence that allows bears and humans to share territory without conflict. They understand intention. She explains to the younger children, who watch with the fascination that marks encounters with possibilities they never imagined. Not our words, but the feelings behind our actions. When we move with respect, they respond with trust. When we show fear without hostility, they show caution without aggression. The lessons extend beyond practical communication to encompass philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness and the boundaries between human intelligence and animal wisdom. The bears' demonstrated ability to plan cooperative activities, modify their behavior to accommodate human needs, and communicate complex information through subtle signals challenges traditional assumptions about cognitive differences between species. Perhaps, Elder Siku suggests during one of her reflective moments, the old stories about humans and animals sharing common language were not metaphors, but memories of relationships that our ancestors understood but we have forgotten. Perhaps Nukka and his family have rediscovered something that was lost, rather than invented something completely new. The teaching stones serve as tools for exploring these concepts, their arrangement allowing children to experiment with different models of relationship and balance, while observing how the bears respond to changes in human behavior and village routines. The stones become a laboratory for understanding cause and effect in interspecies dynamics, providing safe ways to test ideas about cooperation and boundary setting. Young children begin incorporating bear behavior into their play, not through mimicry that reduces complex animals to simple imitation, but through observation that teaches respect for capabilities that exceed human limitations in specific areas. They learn to recognize the subtle signals that indicate bear mood and intention, developing skills that may prove essential as this unprecedented relationship continues to evolve. The bears are teaching us patience, one 8-year-old observes after watching Nukka wait motionless for 30 minutes while fish movements develop into productive fishing opportunities. They don't hurry things that need time to happen naturally. This lesson proves particularly valuable for adults struggling to accept the gradual nature of trust building between species that have historically maintained careful distance from each other. The bear's willingness to accommodate human routines develops slowly, requiring villagers to adjust their expectations about how quickly complex relationships can be established and maintained. The teaching stones themselves seem to gain additional significance as the bears begin to notice their daily rearrangement, with Nukka occasionally approaching close enough to observe the patterns without interfering with their educational purpose. Her attention suggests curiosity about human learning processes, as if she recognizes that the stones serve communication purposes similar to the scent markers and territorial signs that bears use to convey information to each other. They're studying us. Elder Siku realizes during one of these observation sessions just as carefully as we're studying them. This relationship involves mutual learning rather than one-sided adaptation. They're figuring out how human communities work, just as we're learning about bear family structures and communication methods. The stone arrangements evolved to reflect this mutual education process, with patterns that acknowledge the bears as students and teachers rather than simply subjects of human observation. The symbols begin incorporating elements that represent bear perspectives on village life, creating a more complete picture of the complex dynamics that make peaceful coexistence possible in an environment where such relationships were previously considered impossible. The sacred tobacco pouch rests in Elder Siku's weathered hands as she prepares the traditional offering that will honor the spirits of the wild during the crisis that threatens to shatter the unprecedented peace between her village and their remarkable bear neighbors. The pouch, sewn from the finest sealskin and decorated with symbols that represent communication between human and animal realms, contains tobacco leaves that have been carefully preserved for ceremonial occasions when spiritual guidance becomes essential for community survival. The crisis arrives with the sound of diesel engines cutting through the Arctic silence as three snowmobiles approach Uki, carrying hunters whose presence immediately transforms the delicate balance that has characterized recent village life. The hunters, visiting from a settlement 200 miles south, bring with them attitudes about wildlife management that reflect traditional approaches to polar bear encounters, approaches that involve weapons rather than understanding, elimination rather than coexistence. Irak Hansen, the lead hunter, dismounts from his snowmobile with the confident movements of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous predator in any environment. His rifle, a high-powered weapon designed specifically for Arctic hunting conditions, remains readily accessible as he surveys the village with the practiced assessment of someone who has spent decades turning encounters with large wildlife into profitable expeditions. We track 2 polar bears to this area. Henson announces to the villagers who emerge from their homes to greet the unexpected visitors. A large female and a younger bear, probably her cub. Our clients pay premium rates for guided polar bear hunts, and these animals represent significant income for our operation. The silence that greets this announcement carries undertones that Hansen initially misinterprets as fear rather than protective concern for animals who have become part of the village's extended community. His experience with remote Arctic settlements has taught him to expect cooperation with hunting activities that provide economic benefits for isolated communities that have few other sources of external income. Where did you last see the bears? Henson continues, consulting GPS coordinates and digital tracking equipment that represents the technological approach to wildlife management. Our satellite imagery shows them spending significant time in this immediate area, which suggests denning or feeding sites that would make them relatively easy targets. Elder Siku steps forward with the tobacco pouch visible in her hands, its presence serving as both spiritual protection and cultural statement about the appropriate relationship between human beings and the animal spirits that govern Arctic life. Her movement draws Hansen's attention to the ceremonial aspects of what he has assumed would be a straightforward commercial transaction. The bears you seek, she says, with the calm authority that has guided village decisions for 70 years, are under our protection. They have earned safety through actions that demonstrate wisdom, cooperation, and respect for human life. We cannot permit harm to come to creatures who have proven themselves worthy of trust rather than fear. Hansen's response reveals the fundamental conflict between worldviews that cannot be reconciled through simple negotiation. His understanding of polar bears is valuable, hunting targets worth thousands of dollars. Conflicts absolutely with the village's experience of these particular animals as family members who have contributed to community survival rather than threatening it. Ma'am, with respect, polar bears are dangerous predators that pose serious threats to human settlements, Hansen argues. his tone carrying the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to people who lack relevant experience. Our hunting activities actually protect communities like yours by removing animals that could kill villagers if left to establish territorial claims in human areas. The confrontation escalates as Nukka and Siku, responding to the sound of unfamiliar voices and mechanical equipment, approach the village perimeter with the cautious attention they have learned to apply to new situations. Their appearance provides Hansen with immediate confirmation that his tracking has been accurate. But it also reveals the unprecedented nature of what the village has accomplished. Those bears are showing no fear of human presence, Hansen observes, raising his rifle to a ready position that stops just short of immediate threat while maintaining preparedness for action. That makes them extremely dangerous and justifies immediate intervention before they harm village residents. Nukka positions himself between the hunters and the bears with movements that demonstrate protective intent rather than aggressive challenge. His body language conveying determination while avoiding actions that could be interpreted as threatening toward visitors who possess superior firepower. His willingness to risk his life for animals that most people would consider natural enemies provides powerful testimony about the relationships that have developed during weeks of patient trust-building. The sacred tobacco burns in Elder Siku's small ceremonial bowl, its smoke rising into the Arctic air as an offering to spirits who govern the balance between life and death, between human need and animal right, between traditional wisdom and necessary change. The migration calendar carved into the whalebone plaque beside Elder Siku's door displays the natural rhythms that have governed Arctic life for countless generations. Its intricate markings showing the seasonal movements that bring different species through the territory surrounding Uki at predictable times throughout the year. The calendar indicates that polar bear migration season approaches, meaning that Nukka and Siku will soon face the biological imperative to join other bears in the great journey that ensures genetic diversity and territorial balance. Across the Arctic ecosystem, the resolution of the hunter crisis through village unity and Nukka's demonstration of protective rather than aggressive behavior has strengthened the bonds between human and bear families, but it has also highlighted the temporary nature of arrangements that seem to be developing into permanent coexistence. The approaching migration season creates emotional challenges that test everyone's understanding of love, loyalty, and the difference between possession and caring. Nukka watches Siku practice the hunting and swimming skills she will need for survival in the wild, her movements now showing the confident grace of a young bear who has successfully bridged the gap between domestic security and natural capability. Her size has increased dramatically over the months of her recovery and growth, transforming her from the tiny, helpless creature he pulled from freezing waters into a magnificent predator capable of independent survival in conditions that would kill most living things. She's ready, Nayeli observes with the mixture of pride and sadness that characterizes parents watching children achieve the independence that makes departure possible. She has the skills, the strength, and the confidence she needs to succeed among her own kind. But readiness doesn't make letting go any easier. The migration calendar's markings become increasingly relevant as other polar bears begin appearing in the territory, their presence indicating the beginning of seasonal movements that will carry Arctic wildlife hundreds of miles across ice and water to feeding and breeding grounds that support the complex life cycles of northern ecosystems. Nukka's awareness of these approaching migrations creates visible restlessness, as ancient instincts assert their authority over the domestic contentment she has found among humans. The calendar shows that bears begin gathering at the traditional assembly points within 2 weeks, Elder Siku explains, her finger tracing the carved symbols that represent knowledge accumulated over generations of careful observation. Nukka knows this timing through senses we cannot fully understand. and her body is already preparing for the journey, even though her emotions may resist leaving the safety and comfort she has found here. Preparations for departure begin with the same systematic attention to detail that has characterized every aspect of the relationship between human and bear families. Nukka helps Siku practice techniques for communicating with unfamiliar bears, using controlled exposures to scents and sounds that will help her navigate the complex social dynamics of polar bear groups during migration periods. She needs to remember how to be a wild bear. Nukka explains to Tapisa, who has become deeply attached to Siku and struggles with the approaching separation. Not because there's anything wrong with the connection she's formed with us, but because her future depends on her ability to function successfully among her own species. The emotional preparation proves more challenging than the practical training, as bonds formed through life-threatening circumstances and months of daily interaction cannot be severed simply because biological imperatives require geographic separation. Siku demonstrates clear understanding that changes are approaching, her behavior showing the kind of anticipatory stress that characterizes intelligent animals facing major life transitions. Nukuk's response to the approaching migration creates the most complex dynamics, as her maternal instincts conflict with natural urges that have governed polar bear behavior since the species first adapted to Arctic conditions. Her obvious affection for the village that has accepted her presence battles against ancient programming that demands movement, exploration, and participation in breeding cycles that ensure species survival. She's torn between her roles as mother and as wild animal. Elder Siku observes during one of her morning sessions, reading natural signs and seasonal indicators. Both roles are essential to who she is, but they require different choices about where she belongs and how she spends her life. The migration calendar serves as countdown timer for decisions that will reshape the relationships that have defined village life for months, its markings providing precise knowledge about timing, while offering no guidance about the emotional costs of necessary separations. The approaching departure creates urgency around expressing gratitude, completing unfinished communications, and preparing for memories that will have to sustain connections across distances that may prove permanent. As the first groups of migrating polar bears appear on the horizon, their distant forms serving as harbingers of the great journey that will soon claim Nukuk and Siku, the village faces the reality that some of the most meaningful relationships in human experience are defined not by their duration but by their depth. The Memory Keeper's journal lies open on Elder Sik's table, its handmade pages filled with careful observations and detailed drawings that will preserve this unprecedented chapter in village history for future generations who might otherwise dismiss such events as impossible folklore. The journal, bound in sealskin and written with ink made from traditional materials, represents the community's commitment to recording truth rather than legend, ensuring that the lessons learned from this extraordinary relationship will survive to guide future decisions about the boundaries between human settlement and wildlife territory. The final morning arrives with the particular quality of Arctic light that seems to illuminate endings with crystalline clarity, each detail sharp enough to cut memory and bright enough to burn lasting impressions into minds that know they are witnessing something that will never be repeated exactly as it unfolds. Nukuk and Siku position themselves at the village perimeter where their journey will begin, their body language expressing both anticipation for the migration ahead and reluctance to abandon the safety and affection they have. Found among humans, Elder Siku records the scene with the careful attention she brings to all significant village events, her weathered hands moving across the journal pages with strokes that capture not just visual details, but emotional nuances that photographs could never preserve. Nukuk stands with her head turned toward the southern horizon, where other polar bears have begun gathering for migration, she writes. But her eyes return repeatedly to the village where her cub learned to trust creatures that nature designed her to fear. The farewell ceremony follows protocols that Elder Siku develops by combining traditional rituals for honoring departing family members with innovations required for unprecedented circumstances involving non-human participants. The entire village participates, creating a circle of respect around the bears who have taught them that courage sometimes means opening boundaries rather than fortifying them against change. Nukka presents Siku with a final gift, a small carved polar bear that he has fashioned from whale bone during the long evenings when he contemplated this inevitable departure. The carving captures Siku's proportions and distinctive markings with accuracy that reflects months of careful observation. But its real value lies in its representation of love that transcends species, boundaries, and defies conventional understanding of appropriate relationships between human beings and Arctic predators. Siku's response demonstrates the intelligence and emotional complexity that have characterized her interactions with human family members. Throughout her recovery and growth, she examines the carved bear with careful attention, using her remarkable sense of smell to associate it with Nukka's scent and touch, then carries it with the gentle mouth control that bears use to transport precious objects without damage. She understands that this represents memory rather than abandonment, Nayeli observes, tears freezing on her cheeks as she watches the young bear who has become like a daughter prepare to embrace the wild independence that will ensure her survival but end their daily interactions. She knows we're not rejecting her, but releasing her to claim the life she was born to live. The village children, led by Tapisa, perform a song that Elder Siku has taught them for occasions when community members depart for journeys that may not include return. The melody, adapted from traditional hunting songs that honor the spirits of animals whose sacrifice sustains human life, creates sounds that seem to bridge the gap between human language and the vocalizations that bears use to communicate complex emotions. Nukuk's final interaction with the village provides the most powerful demonstration of the mutual understanding that has developed over months of patient trust building. Instead of simply departing with her cub, she approaches the circle of villagers and touches her massive paw to the ground in front of each family, a gesture that seems to acknowledge their individual contributions to her cub's survival and recovery. When Nukuk reaches Nukka, her response exceeds everyone's expectations for what wild animals might understand about gratitude and connection. She gently places her enormous head against his chest in contact that lasts long enough to exchange scents that will preserve memory across whatever distances migration may require. Her breathing slow and deliberate, as if she is consciously creating a moment that both participants will carry with them forever. She's promising to remember, Elder Siku writes in the Memory Keeper's journal, her handwriting reflecting the emotion that characterizes witnesses to events that change fundamental assumptions about the world and humanity's place within it. And she's asking us to remember her not as a bear who became almost human, but as a mother who discovered that love recognizes no boundaries when life itself hangs in the balance. The departure, when it finally comes, happens with the swift decisiveness that characterizes wild animals making essential transitions. Nukuk and Siku move toward the horizon, where other bears wait to begin the great migration, their forms growing smaller against the vast white landscape until they become indistinguishable from the dots of darkness that mark polar bear groups assembling for journeys that have continued unchanged since ice first covered the Arctic seas. The new village totem stands tall beside the community house, its carved surface telling the story of an Eskimo fisherman who saved a drowning polar bear cub and discovered that courage creates bridges where fear builds walls. The totem, crafted by the village's most skilled woodworker using techniques passed down through generations, depicts Nukka with arms outstretched toward a small bear cub, while Siku's mother watches from above with an expression that suggests protection rather than threat. Each figure represents not just individual characters, but the possibility that understanding can triumph over instinct when compassion guides decision-making. 6 months have passed since Nukuk and Siku departed, with the Great Migration, and their absence has left spaces in village routine that cannot be filled, but have been transformed into something resembling shrine-like attention to the lessons their presence taught about the nature of family, courage, and the boundaries between civilization and wildness. The daily activities of fishing, food preparation, and community maintenance continue as they must in places where survival requires constant attention to practical necessities. But they now carry additional meaning derived from the knowledge that cooperation extends beyond human relationships to encompass alliances that transcend species. Nukka's fishing has returned to pre-Nukuk patterns in terms of technique and equipment, but his understanding of Arctic marine ecosystems has been permanently enhanced by observations made during the months when polar bear intelligence supplemented human knowledge about fish behavior and seasonal migration patterns. His catch rates reflect not just individual skill, but wisdom gained through collaboration with creatures whose senses and instincts provide information unavailable to human observation alone. I still position the nets using techniques she taught me. Nukka explains to visitors who come to hear the story that has spread throughout the Arctic communities, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Not because I expect her to return, but because the knowledge she shared about reading water currents and fish movements has become part of how I understand my work. Some gifts continue giving long after the giver has moved beyond reach. The village children, particularly Tapisa, have incorporated the bear story into their play and learning in ways that suggest permanent changes in how they understand relationships between human communities and wildlife. Their games include scenarios where cooperation replaces conflict, where understanding prevents violence, and where courage means protecting rather than eliminating what seems initially threatening or different. The children play differently now, Elder Siku observes, while updating the memory keeper's journal with seasonal observations and community developments. They imagine solutions where previous generations would have seen only problems. They ask questions about animal behavior that demonstrate curiosity rather than fear. The bears changed not just our present, but our future. Through the example they provided about the possibility of peaceful coexistence, annual rituals have been established to honor the memory of Nukuk and Siku while acknowledging the ongoing influence of their brief presence among humans who learned that some of the most meaningful relationships develop from circumstances that seem impossible until courage makes them inevitable. Each winter solstice, the village gathers around the new totem to share stories about cooperation, to discuss decisions that require choosing understanding over fear, and to renew their commitment to approaching unusual situations with open minds rather than closed assumptions. The totem itself becomes a teaching tool that helps preserve the specific details of events that might otherwise fade into general folklore. Its carved images providing visual reminders of actual individuals whose choices created precedents for future encounters between human settlements and Arctic wildlife. Visitors study the wooden figures with interest that suggests recognition that this story represents more than local history. It demonstrates possibilities that could transform human relationships with the natural world if courage and compassion guide decision-making. In circumstances that challenge traditional boundaries, the story spreads because it offers hope. Elder Siku writes during one of her reflective sessions, "In a world where human expansion often means wildlife displacement, where development usually requires elimination of natural systems, This account provides evidence that other approaches remain possible when people choose understanding over convenience, when they select cooperation over domination. The wooden figures on the totem capture a moment that lasted only months, but created influences that will extend across generations. As children who witnessed impossible cooperation between species grow into adults whose decisions will be guided by memories of what becomes possible when fear gives way to trust. The carved bear looks down at the carved human with an expression that suggests recognition rather than submission, acknowledgement rather than gratitude, equality rather than hierarchy. In the Arctic twilight that marks the end of another fishing season, Nukka stands beside the totem that commemorates his transformation from ordinary village fisherman to bridge between worlds that evolution designed to remain separate. The carving preserves not just his image, but his understanding that some rescue operations save more than individual lives. They save possibilities for connection that seemed lost until someone demonstrates the courage to dive into dangerous waters and pull drowning hope back to solid ground.